Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and we'll highlight what's working in your rural communities. You'll hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf.
Some states talk about rural schools in abstract terms. However, Indiana is living it in real time. Property tax reform that starved local units with no backfill mechanism for schools, district budgets under pressure, and a closed building for $1 law that reshapes community decisions overnight. If you lead in a small system, you can feel the squeeze. Staffing, routes, special services, facilities, every move is a trade-off. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Chris Lagoni, Executive Director of the Indiana Small and Rural Schools Association, and the newly named President-elect Designate of the National Rural Education Association. Chris has worn the K-12 hats of teacher, principal, superintendent, and now carries the statewide and national lens. We're going to cut through the noise on consolidation myths, choice policies, and their rural ripple effects, housing as an enrollment strategy, teacher and leader pipelines, and what practical fixes lawmakers could make this year to steady small districts without sacrificing opportunity. We'll also dig into how boards stay focused in a polarized time and the local measures that actually tell the truth about community health. So if you care about turning rural constraints into design choices and keeping the heart of school while you're at it, this conversation is for you. So let's get into it. Chris, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, I want to start with where you've come from. So before the titles and organizations, what has brought you from the classroom and principal seats to leading Indiana's Small and Rural Coalition and now into national leadership with NREA?
I was a rural superintendent in Consolidated, Carroll County, Indiana, and I had left the superintendency to take a higher ed position. It was very attractive to tuition benefit for all my girls. Like many have had the opportunity to move to higher ed. And when I was in my first year of being an assistant professor, there was an opening. It was a part-time opening. Our association has a part-time director. We don't have any offices. It's not a large organization. And we had trouble finding someone who was looking to do something part-time. And so I threw my hat into the ring. I think that was around the end of 16, beginning of 17. And interviewed with the board of directors and was able to come on a part-time basis.
Can you talk about a belief that you have about rural schools in Indiana that you just refuse to compromise on and how that shows up in your daily work?
Well, Indiana's been a leader in school choice, and along with Arizona, we've been one of the leaders in the forefront of what choice looks like. And so you can kind of see where policies go by studying the states that have been out there in it first. And we're under a lot of pressures right now to consolidate rural communities, yet also grow charter schools. There's a lot of policies trying to grow charter schools, and kind of a conflict if you're a true fiscal conservative, because charter schools in Indiana can get property tax dollars. There's a lot of forward thinking school choice policies that have passed through the Indiana General Assembly. And so there's really little difference between a small charter entity and a small school district. And we just really don't see the policy difference. There's charter school networks in our state that have central offices of 36, 40 people. They're running 8 schools. They have full central offices. They're getting property taxes. So we just don't get the almost bias to want to close rural communities because in Indiana, it's very clear that you would have to replace them if the community wanted to with charter schools. The building would remain open. So that's something we're really trying to work through, and it's very specific to Indiana. God bless, we care about all kids, and in a school choice state, we don't throw arrows or anger at our charter school friends. They're trying to do good work for kids. We just have concerns about a policy at a high level that tells this community that you need to close your schools, but this community, we need to grow more. In Indiana, there's not a lot of growing communities. I think there was an article in the Indianapolis Star recently that both the main large school district in that city, IPS, and the charter schools were seeing decreases in enrollment. Families are getting smaller. We have an aging population. It's not a huge growing state. We've had some growth in some areas, but we do have less students than we did years ago. So a fiscal conservative would say, hey, if we don't need all these schools, property taxpayers shouldn't have to support them. But that doesn't follow some of the school choice and logic we get vested in our state.
Yeah.
That's our main issue that we're dealing with a lot.
So I want to dive into some of those concerns that you're dealing with on the ground by asking you first, if you had 60 seconds with a state leader today, what are 2 concrete fixes that rural districts need this year? And what's, if you can think about just one, but what's one unintended consequence that you're warning them about right now?
We have been advocating for a local option income tax for schools. So in Indiana, they took away, as part of property tax reform, there's no local dollars that supports teacher salaries. So if you look at the Why Worlds Matters report that the NREA pushes out, Indiana is the 5th lowest supported when it comes to instructional dollars reaching a classroom, rural districts in the nation. And part of that's because we took away the local support and everything's on a per student funding basis with the state. And in our state, it's complexity index and some other things similar to what the Title I calculations are. And so urban areas do get a little bit more of some of those other fundings, although there's a lot of ELL populations throughout rural Indiana, and there's a lot of poverty, but we do just have less students. So our per student funding is lower. We've been asking for a local option income tax solution. And what in Indiana, if the only way to raise additional dollars is through an additional millage, or what we in the Indiana call referendum, where you're raising the tax rate. Well, rural folks, we're conservative, right? We don't want to, and nobody wants to raise their taxes. No farmer has a benefit from raising their taxes. If you live in a town and you've got a great quality school, that's going to improve the resale value of your home. If you're in a rural area and you've got a 1,000-acre farm and we raise your taxes, there's no benefit to that farmer. The value of that land is the value of that land. So there's a real a non-connecting, the gears aren't meshing on some of those issues. And so we really like to see a local option income tax where if the school board and the community wanted to raise some additional dollars, $400,000, $300,000, they would have the option to do a local option income tax through a voter referendum. Voters could approve it. This is American democracy. The voters could choose to approve that if they want to. And that wouldn't put pressure on our local businesses, our local farmers, and our local citizens to raise their property taxes. It's not going to raise as much, but to help out with teacher retention and salaries, it would be some dollars.
Yeah.
We've had a few schools pass a referendum where the community was kind of faced with hey, we're either going to pass this referendum or we're going to consolidate and close. And a few have done that. But lately, property taxes in Indiana have been on an increase because assessed values have increased, and we've lowered business personal property taxes. And so in property taxes, when you lower one entity's taxes, it does have a tendency to push it to the other ratepayers in there. And so farmers and homeowners, as we've decreased business personal property taxes in Indiana over the last 8 years, there has been a shift along with increases in assessed value. No one's going to deny that property taxes have gone up, but it's also related to the value of the property increasing post-COVID.
Yeah. Can you pair that, Chris, with the closed building for $1 to charters law? Because that is another part of that equation that really kind of boxes communities into closure or consolidation. So from your seat, can you talk about what that policy does? And then how does the combination of those two things really show up for small and rural districts both this year and next year?
Yeah, it was a policy that evolved a long time ago as Indiana became a voucher state. And we have a voucher system where the private schools can receive 90% of what the local school district tuition rate is from the state. And to grow school choice, this policy became, if you're going to close a school building, the decreased enrollment, you have to sell that building to a private school, to a charter, or to a public university for $1. And so there's this whole process where it goes on a magic list kept at the DOE, and it's a big public notice, and charter authorizers and organizers can have a chance to get it. It's been a real policy push point because as we see declining, and it's not just a rural issue, it's an urban issue too. They're going through the process of reforming all of the, there's a ton of charters in the city of Indianapolis, and there's this new entity they're creating. They're basically taking the Indianapolis public schools and all those charters and trying to put them now into one entity. And that group has actually asked to have the dollar law removed for them for the exact same reasons. And we've had different school districts have individual laws passed. I think Hammond area by Chicago had a law passed that they were waived from the dollar law. And so we have all these individual cases where different people have pushed through things for their communities. It's just time. I mean, we have decreasing population. We're in a property tax concern. I mean, it's a major policy concern all across the state. Why do we have this policy? I can think of no other entity of, like, say, fire protection. Well, if we had a decrease in population and we don't need a fire protection district, well, let's keep the firehouse open and let's get a charter fire district and they can go in there and property taxes will remain. It just doesn't make sense. But it's been a major issue. There have been rural charter schools started, not by outside organizers, but mostly parents, where a school district will try to close a building or close a not needed low population building and say, okay, we're going to go to these now 2 buildings instead of 3. And the taxpayers and the parents have said, I don't want my kid on the bus that long. That's 17 miles away. That's X miles away. We're going to try to make a go of it. And we're allowed to take this building for $1. We're allowed to take this charter school and restart and reopen the elementary. And that's happened a couple times. And so the school district never saw the savings. They never saw the benefits from a financial side. And so it gets to this real pushback where, am I going to save money by closing the building if it reopens as a charter? And so we're just like, hey, let's reset this. It's time. Now, the dollar law was started at a time when charter schools no longer didn't have access to property taxes. Now they do. So they're going to get the operational property taxes. In Indiana, the buses and buildings are what the property taxes support. There's also debt. The charter schools can't do debt per se. They can do debt, but they can't do debt through property taxes. So it's just time. The law may have had a point years ago. We had a policy where we'd like to see those buildings be able to transfer to the city or the town and use for adult education, right? Maybe there's a couple suburban areas that have really great models where the local community college took the building next to the high school or built one with city funds, and you've got a great extension campus that kids can walk across the parking lot. Why can't we do it at elementaries? Well, we can't do it. What about adult workforce training? There's a lot of opportunity in rural areas. We could relocate great employment opportunities. We could use those buildings for retraining workers. No, we can't do that. So it's just it's a policy that maybe had its time, but we're really advocating it's time to get rid of it.
Yeah, that's a big messaging problem, especially when a closed building can really still serve the community needs.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, Chris, what the decisions that superintendents are having to make as a result of the local option income tax or the $1 law? What are superintendents having to do or to think about, or being forced to make decisions around staffing or programs or that kind of thing?
I think the biggest issue right now is everybody's trying to understand what their funding levels are going to be. In Indiana, property taxes only support buses and buildings, and if you do have a debt. So I think there's been a lot of policy concern from some lawmakers that schools have been issuing debt, and so there's been a lot of pullback on new rules not allowing schools to bond. And so people are figuring that out. And then it's really an assessed value issue. So let's say we have a rural county, and when we had school consolidation in the 60s, you had to divide the townships up, right? There's townships and then there's counties all the way back to the 1800s. So someone in a rural area was going to get the county seat. And the way we've kind of played that out is there's a little bit of a pattern. Say there's 2 districts in a county. Whoever got the county seat has a little bit better assessed value because there might be a few more businesses. There might be a little bit more light industry there. But the school district that doesn't have the county seat, generally there's a pattern that they're really struggling from an assessed value. We did a study at the university I work at, and we calculated and put every school district on a quartiles based on their assessed value and the assessed value on a per student basis. And what we found was the school districts that had a low assessed value on a per student basis also struggled in generating enough operational dollars and tended to debt more. And that makes sense because they had to move some things to HVAC repairs. Those things had to be debted because they couldn't generate enough dollars. And so it also affected urban areas. When we looked at the quartiles in Indiana, there was this magic list. And if you had a debt ratio over a certain amount, you weren't allowed to debt anymore unless you went to the voters and asked for voter approval. And so it was kind of like the naughty list. Well, what we found when we did the study was the people who were on the naughty list, other than 1 or 2 districts that were just extremely growing suburban areas outside Chicago, Crown Point, some other places where they were seeing actual growth and they were building new schools, a couple suburbs on the west side of Indianapolis and what we call donut counties. The rest of it was they were all school districts that had a low assessed value per student. And so as a school leader, you really can't control that. And so you need to get your facilities under control. If you don't need or an underutilized facility, the best thing that you could do for the taxpayers, and then it's a very hard decision and nobody likes it, whether you're in an urban, suburban, or rural area, the right size your district based on your population. But that's what everybody's trying to figure out. They're working with accountants and folks to try to figure out, because there's been some massive cuts and changes to property taxes, and there's a real fiscal cliff coming in year 3. And so people with cash balances are kind of hanging on with the third years of fiscal cliff that not many will survive. But those low assessed value school districts that have a very low assessed value, they're having conversations or having real questions on how they're going to keep the lights on. And every person in every state where we're seeing higher power and energy bills. I mean, we're seeing energy bills that are higher than people's property tax collections in some places. So this is the big fiscal issue everybody's trying to figure out, and trying to get their taxpayers and their school boards and their communities kind of up to speed of what this means. And there's been a little bit of pushback and from some people that push the policy. I think everybody wants lower property taxes, but it's a big conversation in our state. How do we do that?
Yeah.
Part of the root issue is this personal property tax, and I think they're going to have to look at that. It gets kind of technical, but we had a 30% appreciation floor on business personal property tax and large employers and industry. Just do that go away, and then we've been phasing it out. And but it really, the last reform gave a really good tax benefit to large businesses, and I think the average citizen got like a $300 cut in their property taxes. But locals are really trying to figure out, not just schools, but locals. But the key to the policy is the state gave all the other local units the option to implement a local option income tax. So the county, the city, the small towns, even the small towns were allowed to pass a local option income tax to make up for the cut funds. Schools were not. And so we saw another real and there's a feeling like, that was very purposeful. All these other entities were given the opportunity to raise revenue through a different method, but we were not. And so that's been a big policy push between all folks. And then there's some bills that they'll give some May provision. So, property tax in Indiana is just like a constant conversation of how do we make this work? And it seems like for 15 years.
You've cautioned against treating consolidation as a cure-all, and I think that's wise. Can you talk a little bit about where do efficiencies end and educational trade-offs begin for some of Indiana's towns that have to go down that route?
Well, our organization has no problem with consolidation as long as it's led by the local. We don't have any problem with any community coming together with another community and saying, how can we do this more efficiently and how can we do this better? Mm-hmm. But I think we want the decisions and support to be made and provided by the state to help locals figure this out. When Indiana consolidated back in the 50s and 60s, there were certain metrics developed by the state. And we were dealing with Sputnik, right? And there was a lot of scientific concern. And so we wanted to see improved academic and preparation for our teachers. We wanted to see high schools and school districts, so about 1,000. That was Indiana's metric. They wanted to see about 1,000. Now the research, I think, and different groups like our chamber, they want to see school districts of about 2,000. Well, that's not always possible. I mean, we can have a bunch of county-wide school districts, and they're not going to be at 2,000. We don't have enough people in some areas. I think there's been a lot of criticism of some rural counties have 4 districts or 5 districts. And we've been advocating to give the state, provide some resources. And this is what happened in the 50s and 60s. The collegiate professors, different groups came in and helped schools figure out and help communities do this. It's not a budget year, but that's been our pretty much consistent policy. If you read the research, and we've done the research, transportation's not an area where you're going to see a lot of savings. I think you could see savings in technology, maintenance professionals. There's a big policy push to make a countywide superintendent, kind of like Florida and Indiana. There's some folks interested in that topic, and we would kind of caution, what's going to happen to that school district? Is the board going to run it more like a commissioner or county commissioner, or are they going to then ask the countywide superintendent for an assistant superintendent for their region and district, and you've kind of lost savings? So I think it's more efficient to truly help communities figure this out, give them a little. The last time we funded something, we had real consolidation. In 2010, around there, previous governor, well-known Governor Daniels, there was some funding, and the DOE had some small research grants, and that allowed some districts to, just small grants, $20,000, $10,000 to help figure out what they wanted to do. I think we had 6 consolidations out of that funding. And since then, we really haven't had any. So our mantra has been, if you help the locals out and give them some time and some resources to get some experts to help them do the calculations, I think most people will come together and find a reasonable solution. but don't expect transportation to be an area savings because you're going to be covering more bus miles. But in some areas, you could save on the tech side, and you could save on the maintenance side, and maybe on the central office side. But there's going to be a bunch of bills in Indiana asking for studies to kind of look at that, and we've had to advocate that they only want to look at public schools. Our policy agenda for the Indiana Small and Rural Schools Association, if you're going to make a rule, you need to make it for everybody that accepts tax dollars. And so that's a constant push to say, remember, we've got all these other charter schools, and they have central offices, and they have staff. If you're going to say this model over here is inefficient, you've got counties with dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of charter schools, and they have central office costs. If we're going to do the fiscal analysis, let's do the fiscal analysis for everybody and give every recommendations about how to be more efficient. Yeah. So that's just been our major policy issue. I don't know if I answered your question all the way.
You did, and very thoroughly, and thank you for that, because it just helps, I think, to understand the lay of the land, especially since I'm going to be asking you some questions about some of the particulars on how things are running in Indiana's rural schools. And the perennial issue that leaders are dealing with, and it's not just in your state, I think it's in every state, and it's not just rural, is the teacher and leader pipeline. So can you talk a little bit about what in Indiana is actually moving the needle on recruiting and retaining great teachers and principals, especially in our rural communities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of grow your own concepts. We've seen a lot of, starting at the superintendent level, there's been a lot of change and a lot of turnover at the superintendent level. And I think most states, the smaller districts are a little bit of the training ground, and people move up to larger districts. I think any state could probably see that. If you're in a small district, you're going to do everything, right? You're going to be the transportation director. You're going to have your hand in tech. You're going to get in a truck and plow some snow, and you're the principal's sick. You're going to run over there and you're going to help with that. So that's kind of the leadership development that happens. You know everything. You got your hand in budget. You probably don't have a CFO. You have a treasurer who helps you, but you have your hand in everything. So that makes a really great, well-prepared leader who then moves on to a larger district. So that's one issue. But at the principal level, we see a little bit more of that because the pay is so different, right? The suburban and areas around the big cities. I mean, you can make more as an elementary principal in the city of Indianapolis than you can as a rural leader. I mean, it's just the way it is. So there is, for those who want the opportunity to make more money, going to a larger district, to a suburban urban area, that's always a pressing issue. So I think they are trying to find people who are comfortable with living in their communities. They're trying to develop and grow folks from the area. When you sit down and say, okay, are you comfortable being here? Are you okay with, the opportunities here? My running joke is I remember I was a superintendent, and we were doing an online training when online first came on, and the person was like, "Oh, I'm going to send you guys some Starbucks gift cards for how well you're doing." And I was like, "Well, that's great. Maybe the next time, they take an hour drive, they'll find a Starbucks." But you got to find people who are comfortable doing that. Sometimes young people aren't. So I think that's the biggest thing: trying to develop some folks that are currently living there and that live in their community. And I think there's been some really great examples of that. So they're trying to, Indiana passes laws like that we must have certain baseline salaries to raise teacher pay, because that's always been a concern. So people are figuring out how to do that. And so a lot of dollars have gone on that to equalize salaries, but there's still competition, right? School districts are competing for folks. It used to be 20 years ago, if you were at the top of the scale, you probably weren't going to leave that district. Well, that's long gone, right? They can, we're putting in a lot of flexibility and a lot of ways to compete. And I think figuring out flexibility and who can teach multiple things is something else people are looking at. Can we get this person licensed to teach multiple things? And that's kind of the flexibility people are using. I don't know if anybody's found the magic paintbrush on that. There's a district in Lafayette that has kind of a well-known teacher development program. It's a large suburban district, so I think people have been studying what they're doing and figuring out maybe could we collaborate and do that somehow? But we're kind of looking at different models of how we can support people and help them in their transition. One of my graduate students did a study, and he looked at teacher attrition and looked at a large area and large turnover data. And for the most part, if they could keep the teacher for 5 years, they were going to develop into someone you could keep. And it's that 5-year window of and really got to get them comfortable and developed and supported for that first 5 years, because the bell curve really dropped off after that of turnover.
Interesting. Well, and that tracks with what I've heard too. 3 to 5 years is about when they decide if they're going to stay or not. So that makes sense. You've also linked rural school vitality to housing stock. Can you talk a little bit about that, what you've learned about maybe partnering with municipalities so families can actually move in, or zoning models, those kinds of things?
We have a partnership, and the Indiana Farm Bureau is on our board of directors, and they've just been a great partner, and we support them all we can. And there was some research in Indiana maybe 2 years ago, and Indiana, like a lot of states, has housing affordability issues, and what it costs per square foot to build a house is not what most people can afford. And we partnered with some of the research coming out of Minnesota and tried to bring that here, and did some presentations across the state, and tried to look at housing differently, looking at duplex and move over housing, and how can we help our older folks have better options. And we've sent out stuff to our vocational programs like, hey, if you guys are building a house, try to do a duplex, because the research is for every 2 houses you build, one will have a family with students. So if you only built one house, there's a 50% chance that it may not be occupied by anybody with kiddos. And if you build move over housing for seniors, that opens up a worker house with a family sooner. And we did a presentation to the General Assembly, and the committee who was studying this was full of realtors, developers, and home builders. And so having a conversation about building small homes and duplexes and move over housing went over like a lead balloon, right? So they were looking for solutions from the state that was going to do something to pump some money or programs into building more houses. And I don't see, I don't think anyone has a problem if we figure out how to build more houses. But our policy perspective was, we've got a lot of great homes in small towns. Let's make them more livable. We've got, that's a lot easier and a lot quicker solution to improve those. Indiana's full of something called National Homes. National Homes was a company in Lafayette, Indiana, that built the first kind of like factory built house where they would, pour a slab and bring the homes in on a trailer and pretty much kind of pre-assemble them. They were built 1x2s. So a lot of our small towns, a lot of our cities are full of these national homes. Could we redo those and look at those to make them more livable and attractive to young people? So we were trying to find solutions that were going to help small towns grow quickly and bring some research to the table on that. So we keep trying. The data is pretty clear to us that we do agree with the concept of move over housing and helping. The great analogy was, if the grandma spends $5,000 redoing the bathroom so that she can have access, and redoes the stairs so she can have access upstairs, how ready is that house to be occupied by the next family? And that the homes, while they're owned, they're also a community resource. And so can we have a discussion about how do we make that home attractive to young people? And grandma needs money to survive. Do we want to spend $15,000 of equity redoing the house? Or is that better spent finding a smaller place that's better suited for his or her needs, and having that policy discussion? But we'll keep trying.
Yeah. Chris, one of the things that has come up a lot too, all locales, is broadband and cybersecurity and AI. There's a lot going on with ed tech right now. And I know that you work on the side in that arena. Can you give us your pragmatic take on all of those things, whether it's access and the different resources that are coming out that rural schools might want to vet before they bring in?
Indiana, I must praise, has done a lot with rural broadband connectivity and made heavy investments before the feds did. And they've had a lot of conversations, and they've appointed some folks, and they've created divisions of the state government focused on rural broadband and connectivity. And so that's one area that I must praise them and have had some leadership in. They're putting a lot of fiber in different fiber loops. And one of the frustrating things and kind of a policy agenda we adopted, because we were invited to the table, thankfully, our lieutenant governor has a position that is focused on rural. So the lieutenant governor kind of has the office of OCRA, Office of Community Rural Achievement and stuff that's going on there. So early on, we were invited to the table, and we just kind of said, hey, we need to make sure that if the state's paying for it, that the maps are shared with somebody at the state so that taxpayer dollars are not building fiber on top of fiber, because we're trying to reach the most critical areas that have no access to anything. So I think one of the positives that came out of that is we did have some policies where, hey, if you're going to get that state investment, you need to share your maps with somebody. I realize that's private and your competitive advantage, but if you're taking state money, you should make sure that we're getting those investments. And so fiber's going in a lot of places and ringing around a lot of communities, and the rural power cooperatives have gotten involved. I think there's a lot of solutions. Once you get away from the big fiber loop, I think we have to research and look at all options. For a small entity, a bus garage, an athletics facility, there's a lot of options. People are looking at satellite. Satellite is okay for a small 5 or 6 people. I think there's some latency issues, but if you have a small office or a bus garage or something, look at all solutions at a cost and a cost long term. If you look at, do you want to make the investment once and get done with it? I don't think there's any rule of do this, don't do that. Figure out the best solution. Could it be microwave? Could it be whatever solution? But just figure out what cost is most effective long term. Because what was it going to cost you to keep doing it? If you spend the cost to run the fiber up front, well, it's kind of done. You're not really looking at any cost. If it's cost prohibitive to do it, and you look at some other solution, what are the software costs that are going to be 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road? And in 5 years, have you paid enough that if you just did the fiber and paid that cost, would it have all equaled out? So sometimes we look at the initial number. It's all going back to fiber eventually, right? No matter what solution you have, it's all going to eventually go back to fiber.
Yeah.
So I just got to have to look at the cost of how, in 5 years, what am I still paying for? And would my total cost of install been there? So it's such a broad category. During the pandemic, we were looking at all sorts of solutions. CBRS, we were looking at private LTE. I still think that has a metric for it. Private LTE would allow students to have connectivity at home and at school through the same device. And then you wouldn't have to have switches and all the infrastructure. It would just be one antenna, kind of like your school repeater, broadcasting the school's network over an entire community. I think those kind of investments, with the way there's a lot of pressure on the federal funding for connectivity, I don't know that we can afford to maintain all the switches, maintain the software and all the access point, maintain all these infrastructure costs, and maybe look at CBRS, private LTE, as a solution to where we're just bringing a pipe in with the internet, we're broadcast it, and everybody's got a little bit different type of device, and they're connected here at school with one network, and it's the same network at home because it's broadcasting it over a wide area network. I think some of the costs could be studied on that. And that's something we've been kind of trying to get people to think about, because, man, you buy a switch, that's great. You've got it for 3 years, it's supported, and then you got to buy another one. You buy it's like it's constant turn. And could we think about how we do that differently with the limited funds available?
Yeah. Chris, I want to shift just a little bit and talk about, because you mentioned community partnerships, and I think that's really important in a rural context. Can you talk about some of the community partnerships that you've either seen done well or have participated in yourself? And then what do you recommend if a rural leader was listening and they don't have solid community partnerships in place that they do to mitigate that?
Yeah, I think you're going to have to get out and meet people as much as you can and attend the Rotary or whatever, the chamber. Most areas, it's the old 80-20 rule, right? If you get into a rural area committee, it's the same 20% of people that are on everything, right? They're on Rotary, they're on Lions Club, they're on it's the same 20 people run everything, just because of community involvement. And in rural areas, they tend to be older, right? If you go to a lot of these things, you're seeing a lot of people, unfortunately, that are in their 60s and retired age, and they're the ones helping with all these great philanthropy things. Meeting business folks, I think if you're doing apprenticeships, if you're doing work-based learning, I think engaging in that. When I became a superintendent, kind of had an entry plan process where I had a mentor superintendent who was very seasoned, and he helped me, and we had this whole entry plan where we just went out and talked to people. And so if you're a new superintendent and kind of form the strategic plan for the board, we went out and had some interview questions, and we talked to employers and major landowners, and if you look at your tax rolls, who's paying the most property taxes? Be nice to talk to those people and listen to them and see what their needs are. I think that's the biggest way to build relationships and partnerships, is just go out and talk to people and find some time. They're busy. I mean, you're busy, they're busy, but you do have to find some common time to do that and tell them that you're willing to listen. Redevelopment commissions in our state are big too. So I don't know if in your states, they're called TIF districts, right? A lot of times there's mayors and town folks or county commissioners that control redevelopment districts. And that's really who's having a voice in what businesses and what needs are there. Getting appointed or talking to those folks is a great place to start too, because they know who's interested in the site. They know they've been having those conversations, and maybe there's some opportunity for pass-through funding to meet a special project that you need if the TIF district's doing well and had growth and assessed value. So those are the things you're trying to do while you're also the Title I director and this thing. And not forgetting to delegate. A lot of small districts, they're delegating central office responsibilities to their principals. The elementary principal is also the Title I director. The assistant principal here is also the expulsion hearing officer. You're wearing 4 hats. How can we all do that so that there's time to develop those?
Yeah, well said. So I want you to put your national hat on, because you are the NREA President-elect designate. And I want to talk a little bit about what do you think right now NREA's priorities really should be that are going to help our state affiliates and their rural districts to do the good work of educating the students in their rural communities?
There's many different types of rural, and so we can't put one stamp on rural. Rural next to the Hoosier National Forest looks different than the rural of Northern California, looks different than Southern Illinois, looks different than rural Arizona. But I think some of the same themes, we definitely want to stay away from this concept of less. Rural is somehow deficit.
Yep.
This is the concept we're facing in state policy. Well, you're not as big, so you must not be as good. Well, you can't access any quality instruction. You can't do these things because kids can't go to AP this and AP that, and you don't have AP psychology. So I think we need to really work on, same with broadband and connectivity. That's really not an issue, and document how we overcome those things. Because we do want our kids to access rigorous curriculum, and it may take some some different ways of looking at that and sharing teachers. And I know folks in our state are looking at that, but we need to broadcast that out and tell people we're not a deficit area. We're overcoming, and oftentimes we're doing it in a more efficient and more cost-effective way than other places. So I think that's one theme. I think there's rural everywhere. Indiana has, if we just do locale codes, I did a count once, there was almost 230 school districts that had locale codes that were rural and part of their community. And so think of Chicago, and then there's all these suburbs coming east of Chicago in northern Indiana, and a bunch of those school districts, as they got into as you went into the southern part of their districts, they had rural locale codes. So there's rural everywhere, and embracing all and saying we're all have some of these issues in rural that we can focus on and work together on. I think that's one issue. I listen to other states, and they're doing a lot of leadership in healthcare, working together. That's one. It's just been a policy. Man, it's in Indiana, they just can't seem to get there. Our rural hospitals are suffering. Rural healthcare access is an issue. But the concept of rural schools and hospitals working together, man, it's just a policy lightning bolt for some reason. President Trump in 2016 had some rural healthcare things, and some of our schools implemented them and did distance medical access, and it was okay. But I hear some really good things going on in other states with that. But man, it's a policy lightning rod that we cannot get past in Indiana. It's like the two shall not meet. It's positive and negative electrons and protons for some reason.
Polarity. How would you recommend, if somebody's listening to us talk right now, how would you recommend to small and rural leaders that they bring their voice into national conversations that typically really do focus on big and urban when they're talking about policy? They tend to overlook the latent consequences of their decisions in rural places. What would you say they should start thinking about doing or target to do in the next year or so?
This is a really good question, because I've had a lot of leaders for districts say, "Oh, I'm not political." I'm like, "You're not political? Well, I don't want to get into politics." So, well, we're creating policies that are going to affect you, and communicating to your local leaders how those policies affect students is not political, it's informing. And sometimes, because of the fights over school funding, lawmakers have become deaf to some of the rural districts. I know, at least in our state, because as we were spending $500 million on vouchers, and rural schools saw their funding, and we're the fifth lowest funded rural schools. Sometimes you've talked about it so much, it's like it gets drowned out. Like the long, I know, I've heard it. I've heard that. I've heard it. We still need to engage on policy ideas that are affecting your ability to help kids prepare for the future, or are requiring you to spend on things on time and effort and energy that really isn't going to raise achievement. Mm-hmm. So it's not, and you can have advocacy in a kind and upfront way, and showing love to your neighbor, and just, hey, I want you to understand that how this is going to spend time and resources for our teachers, for our bus drivers, whatever the policy is, away from the valuable time of helping students improve and grow. And that's okay to have that conversation. You can do it in a relaxed and clear manner. And sometimes people feel like, well, I send an email, but pick up the phone. It's okay to pick up the phone and have a conversation with your state senator, with your local offices. And at the national level, it's tough to engage with folks and reach someone, but have those conversations at the local level, in the local offices, and try to develop those partnerships and knowing those people know who they are. I was very lucky in my school district that one of the congressmen that represented our area had an office, and some of the folks from our town worked in his office. And so we'll arrange tours for our congressmen. We were able to communicate well through the local office. Now, I cannot say it was anything I did. It was just by the luck of the draw, a couple of parents worked in his office. But the relationships I learned is with the local office folks can pay dividends, and keep engaging with them. They're your fellow citizens. They're not against you. They're not, they're just trying to inform. And they do have conference calls and conversations as a team about what issues are and how what's happening in DC affects the level. And I know that takes time, but I think that has to be something that's budgeted. If it gets scheduled, it gets done. And so you have to take some time and just have a check-in or coffee, or try to develop a relationship with somebody in that local office, some young person, typically. I mean, you go into the offices as I get older, you look younger and younger.
I hear you.
but they do care about their constituents, and they do want to hear what issues, how you feel. Now, nobody wants to listen to somebody rant and rave about a topic, but if you bring facts and information, reasonable people should hear you out. And sometimes you just disagree on policy, right?
Yep.
And that's okay. We live in a democracy, and it's okay to disagree about policy. And we just keep bringing data. My favorite conversation one time with a lawmaker was, brought all these facts and figures and data. And, at the end of it, he just said, I don't believe your data. Well, I really don't have a counter for I don't believe your data. So thank you for listening, and it's been a good day. I'll move on to the next office. So,
yeah, where do you go from there? You're right, you don't. So, Chris, I always end every episode with the question, what does the term rural advantage mean to you?
Rural advantage is an investment, and that you're part of our community of learners, and the investment is real, and that's tangible. I remember being a rural superintendent. I remember being an assistant principal in a rural area, and the community was truly invested in each student's success. And I mean, buying gas cards to help them get to work. I mean, gathering food, gathering clothing, teachers who had been there for 3 generations and retired and came back and taught 1 or 2 periods a day, and people being excited that they were going to have that teacher or have the chance to have that teacher teach them math or that teacher teach them English, and valuing the investment of that experience in people. I think that's the rural advantage, when a community values and you're part of us. Now, sometimes that takes a little bit of time, right? In a rural area, you could have been there 30 years, but you're not from there. But you're part of the community, and we're gonna go to battle for you. And I think every rural teacher, leader, superintendent, board member, school bus driver has done that and shown where they're willing to invest in people. And that was really the secrets of our education system going back the last 50 years, was the local part of it meant we were going to be invested in you, and we're going to empower all that we can do. Young people, everybody matures at different rates and different times, and not everybody's really ready to hear the message. And sometimes we need to have the resources to come back to recapture that person when they're 19 or 20. And so that's where, we're interested in doing some workforce training, looking at how can we reuse that stuff, because not everybody's maturing and growing at the same rate. And we'd still like to invest in those people and see them be successful and producers and paying taxes and contributing to our communities.
That's a great answer. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks for spending some time with me today, cutting through the noise and really talking about what you're doing in Indiana to focus on student opportunity and to protect core services, asking your lawmakers for fixes that actually stabilize small districts. The work you're doing is important. And so thanks for sharing some of what you're doing with us today.
Well, thank you for your leadership in NREA. We really appreciate you stepping in this year and just doing a great job keeping us focused on those national issues. And we hope that special ed funding kind of recovers and investment in those kiddos too, because we really have some things happening in a lot of places coming out of the opioid crisis, and we've got some kiddos that have experienced some trauma, and they need help and support as they're growing and maturing post the opioid crisis. So we want to see those special ed dollars stabilize.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a good year with IDEA turning 50. So it's I think this is the year to really hit it hard. So thanks for that. Yep. Well, friends, if this sparked an idea, take one step this week. Translate a complex policy into plain language for your community. Identify one partnership that could protect access without new dollars. Maybe bring a local measure of health and not just a test score to your next board briefing. And if the Rural Scoop is helping you lead with clarity and courage, please like the episode, subscribe to the show, and leave a comment with your takeaway. Share it with a colleague who cares about rural schools as much as you do. I'm your host, Melissa Sadorf, and remember, in rural leadership, our strength is our shared story. When we lead together, we thrive together. I'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Rural Scoop. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these important rural conversations going. And we'd love to hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment or share your thoughts. You can follow along and never miss a new release by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform or by following us on social. We're on YouTube at The Rural Scoop, Instagram at msadorf1, and X at msadorf03. The Rural Scoop is produced with support from Vela Educational Consultants. To learn more, visit velaconsultants.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education. And as always, keep leaning in to the rural advantage.